You used to explain yourself. Every decision, every boundary, every choice that didn't match what someone else expected from you. You would feel the discomfort rising the moment someone looked at you sideways, and before they even asked, you were already preparing your case, already softening your words, already making sure they understood you weren't a bad person for simply doing what you needed to do. And then something changed. Quietly, without a dramatic moment, without a conversation or a decision. You just stopped. Someone asked why, and you said something short, and you didn't follow it with an explanation, and the discomfort came and you let it sit there, and nothing collapsed. Now people who knew the old you say you've changed. They say you're distant, cold, too proud to communicate. And you hear those words and you notice something strange. They don't land the way they used to, because somewhere underneath the silence there is something that feels less like coldness and more like ground, like you finally found the floor beneath all the noise. So today I want to talk about that, not to convince you to go back to who you were before, but to help you understand exactly what happened inside you, why it happened, what it means, and why the people who call it arrogance are seeing something real, they're just reading it completely wrong. There's a version of you that most people don't think about anymore, the one who answered every accusation with a paragraph, the one who felt a text go unanswered and immediately wondered what they did wrong, the one who would lie awake replaying a conversation, editing it, figuring out what you should have said differently so they would have understood you better. You weren't anxious exactly, you were responsible. That's how it felt. Like it was your job to make sure everyone around you had an accurate picture of who you were. Like if they misunderstood you, that was a problem you needed to fix. Psychologists have a name for this pattern. It's called self-monitoring. And in moderate amounts, it's healthy. It helps us navigate social environments. But when it becomes compulsive, when you can't make a single decision without mentally preparing your defense, it stops being social awareness and starts being something else entirely. Dr. Mark Leary at Duke University spent decades studying what he calls the sociometer. The idea is simple but profound. Your brain has an internal gauge that monitors how accepted you are by the people around you. And for some people, people who grew up in environments where approval was unpredictable, that gauge becomes hypersensitive. It stops being a background signal. It becomes the loudest thing in the room. And every unexplained choice, every undefended decision, every silence where a justification should be, felt like the needle dropping toward danger. So you explained, not because you were weak, because your nervous system had learned that unexplained meant unsafe. The shift rarely happens all at once. It usually starts with one moment, one specific moment where you explained yourself completely, clearly, honestly, carefully, and it changed absolutely nothing. They heard everything you said and they still decided what they had already decided. Or maybe you explained yourself and they used it against you, took your honesty and turned it into ammunition. Or maybe, and this one is the quietest, you explained yourself perfectly and you realized halfway through that you didn't actually owe them this, that you were standing in the middle of a courtroom you had built yourself, defending yourself to a judge who had never been appointed. That moment, that is where the shift begins. Not in anger, not in coldness, in clarity. Researchers at the University of California studying emotional regulation found something quietly remarkable. People who have experienced repeated cycles of explaining, being misunderstood, and explaining again eventually undergo what they described as an explanatory withdrawal. The brain, after enough evidence, stops sending the signal that says this explanation will help because the data doesn't support it anymore. This isn't shutdown. This isn't avoidance. This is your brain updating its model of the world based on actual lived experience. In other words, your silence isn't emotional immaturity. It's the conclusion of a very long experiment. Here's where it gets complicated, because from the outside, your silence looks exactly like arrogance. And I want to be honest with you about that, not to make you doubt yourself, but because understanding why people misread you is part of understanding yourself more completely. When someone who used to receive your explanations stops receiving them, their brain registers a loss of access, and human beings tend to interpret a loss of access in two ways. Either something is wrong with the relationship or something is wrong with them. And most people, because self-protection is a deeply human instinct, choose the second interpretation. You think you're better than me now. You've become too proud to communicate. You used to be open, now you're just closed off. What they're actually responding to is not your silence, it's the shift in power that your silence represents. Because when you explained yourself constantly, you were handing people something. You were giving them the ability to evaluate you, to approve or reject your reasoning, to decide whether your choices were valid.
and the moment you stopped, you took that ability back. Dr. Harriet Lerner, clinical psychologist and author of The Dance of Anger, describes this dynamic precisely. When one person in a relationship system stops over-functioning, stops over-explaining, over-apologizing, over-accommodating, the other people in that system experience it as a threat, not because you've become cold, because the dynamic they relied on no longer works the way it used to. Your silence didn't create a problem, it revealed one that was already there. And here's the part nobody talks about when they talk about this. I want to be careful here, because not all silence is wisdom, and this is important enough to say directly. There is a version of not explaining yourself that comes from growth, from self-respect, from a quiet understanding that your choices don't require a jury. And there is another version that comes from pain, from deciding that vulnerability always ends badly, from building a wall so complete that even the people who deserve access can't find the door. The first version feels like peace, the second version feels like safety, but underneath it, if you're honest, it feels a little like loneliness too. Here's how you tell the difference. When you stay silent with someone who has proven they'll misuse your words, that is a boundary, built from data, built from experience. It protects without punishing. When you stay silent with everyone, including the people who have shown up for you, who have earned your trust, who have never given you a reason to close, that is a wall. And walls don't know the difference between threats and allies. They just keep everyone out equally. The goal was never silence, the goal was discernment, knowing who gets the full version of you and being at peace giving everyone else something smaller. That discernment, that quiet, confident selectivity is not arrogance. It is one of the most sophisticated forms of emotional intelligence a human being can develop. Here's what I want you to understand about the person you've become. You are not cold. Cold people don't think about this. Cold people don't watch a video like this and feel it somewhere specific in their chest. You are not arrogant. Arrogant people believe they're above accountability. You're not above accountability. You've simply stopped confusing accountability with performance. You're not closed. You are careful. And careful is what happens when you've learned through actual experience, not theory, that your inner world is valuable enough to protect. There's a concept in psychology called self-disclosure regulation. Research published in the Journal of Personality found that people who regulate what they share, who choose vulnerability deliberately rather than defaulting to over-explanation, report significantly higher levels of self-respect, relational satisfaction, and emotional stability. They also, and this is the part worth sitting with, tend to have deeper relationships. Not more relationships, deeper ones. Because when you stop explaining yourself to everyone, the conversations you do have carry a different weight. They mean something because they were chosen. The people who know the full version of you know it because they earned it, not because you handed it to everyone hoping someone would handle it carefully. That is not arrogance, that's respect. For yourself and, quietly, for the people you do let in. If you've been carrying the quiet guilt of someone who used to be more open, if you've been wondering whether the person you're becoming is someone you should be worried about, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not becoming less. You are becoming more specific, more honest about what you have to give and who you're willing to give it to, more protective of the version of yourself that took years of difficulty to build, more comfortable with the fact that not everyone needs to understand you for your life to make sense. The people who knew you when you explained everything might call this change loss, and in a way they're right. Something was lost. The version of you that needed their approval to feel okay about your own choices, that version is gone. And you're not going to get it back, and you don't want it back, because what replaced it is something they don't have a word for yet. It's the quiet, the ground, the sense of yourself that doesn't require anyone else's signature to be valid. Harvard psychologist Dr. Robert Kagan spent 40 years studying adult development. He found that the most psychologically mature adults share one defining quality. They have an internal sense of self that exists independently of how others see them, not because they don't care about people, because they have stopped outsourcing the question of who they are to people who were never qualified to answer it. That's what you've been building, quietly, without realizing it had a name. You stopped explaining yourself, not because you gave up on being understood, but because you finally understood yourself well enough to stop needing everyone else to catch up. That's not arrogance. That's arrival. If this found you at the right moment, leave a comment, even just one word. I read every single one. And if someone in your life needs to hear that their silence isn't something to be ashamed of, send this to them. They'll know why.